impacted Latinx folks, but a lot of Black and Latinx immigrants, right, have actually been kept in the Remain in Mexico policy. And, those things are very clear, but they're also not unique to President Trump, right? So, President Obama famously, infamously, however you want to put it, nicknamed Deporter-in-Chief because he did deport millions of people during his presidency. Regardless of who won, this work was going to need to continue, right? People were going to continue to be demonized. Black people were going to continue, unfortunately, Black people are going to continue to have to fight for their lives, right? When the Black Lives Matter movement is going to be as relevant as ever. I don't doubt that people will continue to be detained. Critical difference, right, is that the previous president used really overt rhetoric. And I think that the difference in past presidents and President Trump is that, there was a threat to democracy itself, right? And a descent into fascism and a descent into the potential genocide of people right before the election, right? There were hysterectomies occurring in a detention center in Georgia. There are already threats to the physical safety of Black people in the United States. But I think that the ways in which President Trump was inciting even further violence, I think created even more physical danger than there already was, right, for Black and Brown communities. Now that President Biden has won, I think there is at least the possibility of Black and Brown communities getting a seat at the table. Movements can continue, and that work can continue as it's been happening for a really long time without the fear of a further descent into fascism, right? In Philadelphia, Walter Wallace was killed about a week before the election. And West Philly, which is predominantly Black and had been tear gassed by police, and just residents had been tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets after protests for George Floyd in May. Joe Biden went to Philly in the last week, right before the election. And one of the first things that somebody asked him about Walter Wallace, and he said the rioting and looting has to stop, right? Not condolences or anything about the right to protest or anything about, extrajudicial killings of Black people by the police, but we will see, right? I think that LDF is going to be as relevant as it's ever been, and that the work of Black and Brown organizers is going to be as relevant as it's ever been.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that because I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind with the results of the election is that this work continues and that not to lose sight of why this work is happening, even though a lot of the circumstances that brought this work, immigration work, social movements such as like BLM, the reasons why that work started in the first place, though it was exacerbated during, the Trump administration, definitely those problems pre-existed the Trump administration. And that's one thing I kind of fear personally, that people will kind of lose sight of that and forget that, deportation, police violence against Black and Brown communities, that these things existed prior to Trump. And we need to continue to push like on the inside and on the outside to change the circumstances we're in for the better. Because at the end of the day, like you said, one administration can do so much. It can only do so much. The work has to go beyond.
Social movements do much more than any one politician can, right? I think that's, it'd be great if we could achieve more, but it is true that it's people, right? Grassroots movements, civil rights lawyers do a little bit of our part, but everybody doing, working in their different lane, but really people who are impacted are doing the most.
when you sort of discussed the hostility, incendiary rhetoric of the Trump administration, and Chase touching on how like all of that preceded Trump. We're talking about elements of the United States that are underlying in society, in American society, that are pervasive. We know that they're there, but they don't always present themselves as openly as someone like Donald Trump does. And just talking about that incendiary rhetoric and then violence against marginalized communities, specifically, if we could talk about like violence or hostility against voting rights, actually, we wanted to kind of ask about sort of forms of voter suppression you've seen in the South, how you've gone about combating it, and sort of touching on voter ID cases, maybe mail-in ballots. I know that there have been cases regarding voter ID laws, such as the Crawford case, which happened within the past decade, and then, or the past 2 decades, and then there's Texas and NAACP versus Steen. But if you wanted to talk a little bit about your work in that sector and how you've seen yourself actually activate your talents and your
some
skills
good examples. It's interesting
to combat
that we're having this conversation in the context of kind of more overt incendiary, racist, white supremacist language, and then things like voter ID laws, which are like very subtle, right? They still have an incredible burden on Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities, just to be explicit, right? And so that's one of those interesting things where before Trump, people would be very secretive about how they were going about it, right? No state that is enacting photo ID laws is admitting that this is supposed to suppress votes, right? The justification, as it was in Crawford and as it is in the Alabama photo ID case, which I've been working on while at LDF, the justification is voter fraud. Somebody who's dead, somebody's casting a ballot on their behalf, or who knows, any number of strange justifications, when there just isn't that data to back it up. Truly, I think that photo ID laws are just an effort to get Black and Brown people to vote less, right? It's not like a poll tax, which is just more overt, which ironically, right, in Florida, that's what you're seeing with the disenfranchisement of people with felony convictions. And so for me, that's actually very explicit. But the gymnastics, right, of saying, well, this person owed these fines and fees, any law, right, that takes away people's right to vote because of criminal convictions is going to have a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown people, because Black and Brown people are already, being incarcerated. They're being funneled into mass incarceration. But you also mentioned mail-in voting, right? There was a big controversy about mail-in voting ahead of this election, which is, hard to believe that it would be considered political since there's been an ongoing pandemic. Again, the LDF team, we brought several lawsuits trying to make absentee voting or mail-in voting more accessible. And I can speak to the one that I'm on, again, in Alabama. There they have really difficult to access absentee voting. Normally, you have to have a specific excuse, right? Like you're going to be out of state, or you're going to be working, or, you have a disability that's like a musculoskeletal disability that specifically impacts your movement. So not just any disability, right? But one they set out for you. And on top of that, you are over 65 or consider yourself disabled. For almost every instance, you have to apply, and with that application include a photo ID, like a copy of your photo ID. There are a couple of categories that you don't have to send a photo ID copy for, but so you already have to provide an excuse. You have to provide a photocopy of your ID, and then you send in that application. And then once you get back your mail-in ballot, you have to have 2 witnesses sign it or get a notary, which, all of these provisions are already burdensome outside of a pandemic, right? It's already like you have to have access to a printer, right? If you're going to have to print out your photo ID, you are going to have access to other people, right? Or a notary, which notaries can charge a fee. So again, going back to the poll tax notion, But in a pandemic, when Black people are being disproportionately killed by COVID-19, it feels even more, right, like even more overt, even though the state of Alabama throughout that case, said, if you can make it to get groceries, if you can, do all of these things, it's an inconvenience. And they, in their court papers talked about our clients not being creative, but asking people, and especially Black people who are disproportionately being killed by COVID-19, to be creative with their lives in order to vote, which is supposed to be a fundamental right. It's pretty horrific. We won at trial, but the state appealed it twice, and the Supreme Court stayed our win in advance of the election. So actually, people have to comply with the witness requirement. There were 2 weeks where we succeeded, but the Supreme Court thought it was Alabama's prerogative, and there were a lot of different measures like that the Supreme Court left in place.
I wanted to touch on how you said these are sort of subtle forms of oppression, because it seems like there's a lot of subtle ways in which, racism, mechanisms of racism are sort of spread out within different institutions. In this case, the legal institution or the political institution. These different things can be difficult to battle, as you stated before, because you have these different mechanisms of institutional racism at play under the guise of, oh, we don't want voter fraud, or we want to ensure that the vote is fair and that our electoral votes are fair and things like that. People are not being able to vote, specifically like Black and brown people. I was just wondering if there were other subtle ways in which people are marginal, specifically Black and brown communities are being marginalized and being disenfranchised that we aren't mentioning or talking about. Because I feel like mail-in ballots are sort of a common problem that a lot of people have, and voter ID can also be somewhat of a more known issue of voter suppression. So are there other forms that are even more subtle than what we've been talking about already?
There are a few. Even thinking about the census count, right, for the last decennial just finished. Every marginalized person needs to be counted. Children are supposed to be counted. Undocumented people are supposed to be counted. But there was a whole battle, right, where the president didn't want, or rather wanted to ask a citizenship question, right? And that anything that would chill participation has an impact on Black and brown voting rights, because this is how district lines get drawn, right? For the next 10 years. Adding something like, are you a citizen? I think just like with voter ID laws, people might take for granted, well, I have a photo ID, right? So what's so hard about that? But in reality, right, it costs a lot of money. It can be hard for you to get to the DMV. It might be hard for you to get childcare, any number of issues. Maybe you don't have a birth certificate. Frankly, something that I had not thought about was people who were born in the Jim Crow era might not have a birth certificate because they were born at home, because they weren't allowed to go to the hospital because they were Black and the hospital nearest them was for white people. Something I had not. So there are those kinds of barriers to getting a photo ID that are subtler. Something like asking, are you a citizen, right? I can imagine some people would think it's not that unreasonable, but it would have a chilling effect, right, on people filling out the census, and then they may not get representation. They may not get dollars from the federal government to their district, right? They may not be counted and therefore included when district lines are drawn for future elections, right? And that's one subtle right? Again, a lot of this, may not be subtle for a lot of people. It's more quote unquote sophisticated than just saying I'm trying to not count Black people. Prison-based gerrymandering, right, is one issue that I think again, like not a lot of people are talking about it or thinking